Yamadarang Yurudu Marang Corrinne Sullivan Wiradjuri Garambang Yurudu Kirua Garang Baramarigol Darag Nura Garang Garambang Yinimiara Huingara. I like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Baramaragal country or Darug nation that we are zooming from and presenting from today. I also extend my respects to elders past and present and the nations of people who are zooming in from unceded lands, both within Australia and globally. And I pay my respects to all elders past, present, and pay my respects to all Indigenous peoples who are listening here today. My name is Corrienne Sullivan. I'm an Aboriginal scholar from the Wiradjuri Nation in central west of New South Wales. I'm the Associate Dean of Indigenous Education in the School of Social Sciences and a Senior Lecturer at Western Sydney University. I'd like to introduce my colleagues. First, I will start with one of our collaborators who isn't with us today, and that's Dr. Beth Hayatot. Beth is an Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Native American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Jessica Weir is a human geographer at Western Sydney University who tracks how social and ecological justice relate, often with the mentorship of Indigenous colleagues, friends and leaders, and me. I'm other. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sibyl Diver. Sibyl is an interdisciplinary environmental scientist. She teaches environmental justice at Stanford University and does community engaged research on Indigenous water governance, focusing on Pacific Northwest salmon watersheds. And of course, Dr. Carolyn Smith. Carolyn is a California Indian postdoctoral scholar in the Vice Chancellor's Office of Research at the University of California, Berkeley, and is focusing her research on reparation processes. I got that word out today. Most recently, she has worked for two California-based nonprofits that provide cultural, social, and economic services to California Indian communities. Carolyn is a traditional basket weaver and artist and has co-authored a series of ethnobotanical publications from the Corrinne tribe elder basket weavers. That is all today. That is all. Is that everyone? Is that the host of thousands? I think we have us all. So we are a collective that have been brought together to talk to you today about our poster series. We're going to talk a bit about the posters that we did, but also talk about how we built together and developed our relationships as a collaborative. Feel free as we present today to tweet what we are doing, what we're talking about, thoughts and feelings, because we are capturing that as part of our impact of our research today and ongoingly. Are you okay? You want to do it? You want to drive?
Yeah, sure.
Don't feel like we're pre-negotiated.
How do I make it go down?
Maybe we click. Hey,
Excellent.
excellent. So what we're hoping from today is to have three key points that we want you to tune in to think about. Firstly, that what we're talking about today is not somewhere else. It is here and it is wherever you are as well. This is the here, this is the now, it is the us. It's not the other, it's not the them, it is the us, and it's us all together. And what we're presenting today is more than just case studies. Our posters are more than just case studies. What we would hope to achieve today is an understanding and identifying of the centering and decentering of Indigenous voices and when and where those voices matter and what your role is in projecting those voices and amplifying those voices. And also we would hope that we will leave you with some practical steps. After we learn some things today, we're going to give some advice about what you're going to do next. You laugh.
Okay, great.
Okay, you good?
Good.
Good.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Good. Sorry, we've developed what we believe to be a comedy act, but clearly when no one else is laughing, perhaps not so funny. What we want to talk today,
Not yet. Okay.
We want to talk about the decentering of colonial privilege
and where we might centre Indigenous peoples, and what this means in terms of decolonising practice. Of what is often used as a decolonising idea is often a buzzword that actually means other things. And we're going to get to this more at the end. But what I want to emphasise right now is that decolonising is around the ideas of challenging and dismantling power and privilege. It's about giving up, stepping back and stepping in and releasing power. It's about challenging, disrupting, disturbing, potentially even burning down the structures and processes that enable and reinforce colonial structures and colonial ways of working. And it's also about how and where resources are used, abused, or where they're redistributed and how they're distributed, and the authority in which those things are done and how those resources are disseminated amongst us. Ultimately, we would hope to start a conversation about how you might think about the ways that, and when you must step back, and also when you're needed to step in and when to step up, right? Click. Yes, thank you. You're on it. So I talked a little bit about decolonisation and being a bit of a buzzword. Often people use decolonisation to mean parts of the process of decolonisation, but decolonisation is the end point. What often happens is, we've got to remember, and I use Tuck and Yang's definition of decolonisation, and that is ultimately decolonisation is about the repatriation of Indigenous life and land. Until that happens, we are not decolonising. We're probably doing a series of things that we hope might end there, but unless we're dismantling structures along those ways, then we are not decolonising. What we potentially are doing are indigenising, including, we're doing inclusive work. We're doing indigenising work. We actually are not decolonising anything if we put Indigenous voices in our curriculum or have them speak at an event like this. This is not decolonising work, because at this point, we haven't challenged any structure, we haven't challenged any power, we haven't redistributed or thought about the distribution of power, resources, and who's speaking and when. This is the first time an Indigenous voice has been present and spoken in the Institute of Culture and Society. We've started today to indigenise this space, but not to decolonise it, not yet.
Yeah, the first seminar led by an Indigenous scholar is here, so thank you. And also thanks to Carolyn, who's online. And I will click down.
You're going to click down? So I just want to share some global connections and empires around Indigenous peoples and humanities in the academy and what we are talking about. And I appreciate here that I'm only including statistics from 3 spaces, which does mean that, in fact, I'm silencing some other spaces here. But I think in terms of our direct impacts and where we're working globally at this point in time, these are the most pertinent to know. So for Maori in Aotearoa, Maori represent 5% of the permanent academic workforce in that country, known as Aotearoa, or otherwise known as New Zealand. And there has been no growth, and I suspect that that number has actually slipped since COVID and the multiple purges that have happened across many of our institutions. In Turtle Island, otherwise known as the US, and all Northern America and Canadian spaces, the Native American faculty are either minuscule or 0. And there has been a downward trend, and that has not seen an increase either in that space. In the country that we call Australia, academic workforce is 1.2%. So there is a limited number of voices of Indigenous peoples in our academies globally, which means 2 things. 1, we cannot do all the work. There's simply not enough of us to go around. But two, if you're going to do the work, how are you centering the Indigenous voices and people, issues, matters, ideas, situations, circumstances? Who are you bringing along for the ride, and whose voice are you centering first? We can see, I'd like to say historically, but you know, I have the mic, so I'm going to be a bit more controversial. We also see currently the way that which non-Indigenous people assert themselves as expert over Indigenous spaces, people, knowledges, philosophies, places. Thank you. We've developed 4 comic art posters as a collaborative of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples as an arts-based intervention to start conversation, to have a poke of fun, to have a comical way of actually bringing to the fore the microaggressions, transgressions, and I will say it, the racism that Indigenous scholars have to put up with in working in this space, and what we fight against and who we fight for. But these are comical, they're meant to be fun, but they are also serious. They actually are underlined with a serious mentality, and bringing this together, we're going to tell the story of how we brought it together. But before I just pass over to Sibyl in passing this over, I'm just going to give you the small bit about my experience as being part of this collective. We were asked as a group to write some stories, some short vignettes of examples of the extractive academy. When we got into the room to share these, the Indigenous people had at least 12 stories of incidences that had happened in the previous week. Our non-Indigenous scholars, as part of the collaborative, had 3 or 4 stories that had happened over their career that they had witnessed. These are our stories and these are our posters. I'd now like to hand over to Sibyl.
Thank you, Corrinne. So I'll share my screen now and the posters for a brief overview. And I just want to share that it's a real privilege to be able to be here and to share this collective work, and have had the opportunity to be part of this process. I feel personally that the posters are very powerful, but also just being part of this group is probably even more powerful for myself. So thank you for that opportunity. And the opportunity to have some new colleagues and friends and to visit you in Australia today from the US. So the posters are found on this website here at astracomics.com, and they can be downloaded for free. So we'll invite you to do that and to take a look on your own time to engage with the posters. But for now, I'll share a quick overview. Let me check it. How is the vocal? Is it possible to hear?
Yes, but speak a little bit more quietly, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So the first poster is Pass the Ball. And this poster expresses frustration about non-Native scholars not recognizing Native scholars as experts and refusing to pass the ball. And it imagines a win for the team when Native scholars are valued. And this poster, as you can see, profiles a traditional game of lacrosse invented by the Haudenosaunee, and it later taken up by European settlers. And as we move from the sepia here through the poster to full color, we see this problem, refusing to pass the ball, really repeating itself over generations. And as a non-Indigenous person, I'm reminded to center Indigenous leadership on our team. So I'll move now to the second poster. This is called the SS Academy. And it depicts the multiple forms of microaggressions and tokenism experienced by many Indigenous scholars. And the cutaway views here of the large cruise boat invite you into a series of vignettes. For example, in this one moment here, we see Indigenous scholars arriving with excitement, ready to build their career in the academy. Yep, I've made it. This is it. And then just in the cabin above, we see an Indigenous woman frustrated with the lack of recognition for her contributions on her merits. And her thought bubble is here saying, they don't want my ideas, my thoughts, my intellect, just my Indigenous identity. They want me to bleed it onto the page, sigh. And so we have, there's other stories that are projected here that you can take a look at as well. Our third poster is here. This is called Indigenous Land. And this comic emphasizes how the university campus always was and always will be Indigenous land. And we see an Indigenous scholar and a white administrator walking here among impermanent structures. And we see the administrator being blind to the Indigenous identity of his colleague and also to the land. At the same time, we see the ongoing presence of Indigenous peoples and ancestors and the land itself as being foundational to the contemporary teaching and learning in higher education and occurring through multiple Indigenous nations and land-based traditions persisting in place. And then finally, the last poster is Extraction Zombies. And this is highlighting the minority tax and the extractive nature of the academy. And it opens with a zombie attack here on Indigenous scholars. I need an Indigenous reviewer, an Indigenous committee member. I need your name on my grant proposal. And in this way, we begin to appreciate the objectification and transactional relationships with Indigenous scholars within the academy. And we move along, we see that, some are taken in by the brie cheese and the false promises of an office along the way, but others make it to the lab where they concoct a cure that's bringing university leaders back to their senses through an Indigenous antidote for respectful relations. So I hope you enjoyed that World War II. I don't think it does the posters justice, but it gives everybody a feel for what we're doing, and I'll pass it back to the main PowerPoint and add a few more comments. So I think what I wanted to convey, in addition to providing that overview to the posters, is that in the academy, we really are, we're really grounding some of the storytelling in the posters in our scholarship. And we really do have this challenge of encountering a lack of appreciation of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous scholars that's been mentioned by Corrinne today and is mentioned clearly in the literature. And it's also something we see as allies, where even as we see lip service being paid to the limitations of Western science in addressing global change, the wildfires that we experience, and other challenges, we also we hear academics expressing their interest in Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous leadership, and yet over and over we see the prominence of Western science frameworks and ways of knowing. We see Indigenous knowledge systems that are reduced to data as confirmation of a dominant science project. We see the lack of visibility and the lack of hiring of Indigenous peoples in the academy. And we hear things like, I hear things in my own department, just speaking for myself. Oh, we'd hire more people, but they're just not there, or they're not at the level. And I think we want to take this opportunity to make that visible and to notice this is recapitulating colonial history, once again, legitimizing the disappearing of Indigenous peoples. And next slide. even though there's been decades of Indigenous movements really responding to structural racism and uneven power relations in dominant society, Indigenous leadership in the academy, these problems are still ongoing. And they're really triggering the need for Indigenous-led resistance and resurgence and resilience and refusal work now more than ever, the need for solidarity work across intersecting movements, and the need for allies and accomplices or standing with Indigenous leaders, which is one of the things that brings us all here today, and gets me very excited about this meeting you all around the table. And I'll pass it to Jess now to share more. Thank you.
Okay, hi. Yeah, I'd also like to say how extraordinary it's been to be part of this collective, and it's been like a masterclass in learning about this. And Sibyl and I we're in this space working for up to decades, and we just learned so much from our colleagues here. So now I just want to talk in terms of the Extractive Academy. My current thing that's really bugging me is the literature. So I thought I'd talk about that today. So Indigenous scholars have been writing about all sorts of topics for decades. It's there and it's present and it's growing. But I recently did a paper that was mainly in non-Indigenous literature and went through a very rigorous peer review process. And I was amazed at the extent of the literature when it comes to this. It was on natural hazard policy and how science is taken up in the public sector, and it's so codified and intense and replicating itself, and it's this extraordinary conversation that's going on, which is not communicating with Indigenous literature, and you can just see it going on and becoming larger, and then I'm having to demonstrate. You have to demonstrate your scholarly expertise and location in relation to all this literature. When those people haven't read the Indigenous literature and don't understand that what they're doing is continuing to exclude what Indigenous people are saying in these areas. And Indigenous scholars also critique the critical literature on these matters as well. And it feels like this massive boat, like the SS Academy, that it's so hard to turn around, because it's like, well, you've got to, have you cited this person? Have you looked at this person's work? Blah, 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 blah. And it's like, how do you get all those scholars and all that scholarship to start centering Indigenous literature and reading Indigenous scholars? And it's a lot. And so recently there was a request for a quote to do a literature review on Aboriginal people's culture and well-being and disaster relief and recovery in Victoria. And the thing is, there's not a single paper on that. So, I mean, the public sector puts out a request for quote on this. There's not a single paper. Actually, there's not a single paper on that in temperate Southern Australia. And there are a few papers from Northern Australia, and they say that Indigenous people are excluded from these spaces. And those papers are just a handful. So that's just disaster relief and recovery. You can just apply that to any topic you want. And so how do we have this situation? It really is a very material thing. It reflects an absence of actual people, institutions and programs, funding schemes, norms, conferences, professional societies, and so on. And it reflects places and practices that do not make Indigenous scholars and their methodologies, practices, service, institutions, etc. welcome, legitimate, and valued. And I'm seeing this in the natural hazard space, which is where I've been working a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. And it's really obvious in the evidence that's available. So, for example, in the back of this slide is the Victorian Bushfire Royal Commission, the one from 2009. In that massive Royal Commission, Indigenous people are mentioned under a heading called the past in an introductory section. And then there's like one other sentence about Indigenous people saying that Indigenous cultural heritage is important, somewhere buried in one of the volumes. So they're just not even present. And yet it's Indigenous land, Indigenous people are out there as firefighters and dying in that bushfire. And it's just astounding. And so this audience here would really appreciate what Indigenous people are actually saying about the world, which is so extraordinary, actually really goes to what evidence is. And there's some amazing papers out there to learn from. And now I'm passing over to the lovely Carolyn Smith. So if you'd like to unmute.
Thank you. Yotoa, thank you. The academic ball rarely gets passed to me. I'm a token, I fulfill a quota. I am the picture-perfect image on the diversity poster. I am marked, yet I am erased. While understanding these realities of my experience, I persist, dipping in and out of the academy. I persist because I have work to do. I persist despite the ball not being passed to me very often. Rewiring the way in which research is conceived of, carried out, and shared is the only way in which I can survive in the academy. Mine is a holistic research practice grounded in Indigenous methodologies, and it is a responsibility to my family, to my community, and to my tribe. It is relational accountability to all my relations. Sean Wilson, who wrote Research is Ceremony, states, quote, "The shared aspects of relationality and relational accountability can be put into practice through a choice of research topic, methods of data collection, forms of analysis, and presentation of information. But the crux of all of this is the ethical responsibility and the moral responsibility to work in collaboration. Through relational accountability, collaboration, and ethical commitments, we can begin to move past the verbiage of quote unquote perspectives, particularly Indigenous perspectives of those with whom we work. But instead, we can honor the worldview that is shared by respecting and legitimizing the situated knowledges of those who have an understanding that may be different from our own. This way, we are not marginalizing the depth of knowledge with those with whom we work. We are not creating light and shadows, perspective versus certainty. Thinking past perspectives, we can be supportive of the emergence of an Indigenous futurity by reevaluating academic and public understandings of research and histories. This is how I envision our collaboration on this poster series, an ethical and moral commitment, legitimizing Indigenous experiences in the academy, and making visible an Indigenous future that reevaluates and writes a more certain understanding of Indigenous space in the academy. Next slide, please. So the process, which Sibyl and Jess will describe in a few moments, didn't happen without a lot of pre-work and scaffolding, like Corrinne had mentioned earlier. So much planning went into the process. Something this authentic, this true, could not have happened without the relationships and the trust that has been built up for years. That is relational accountability. from Sibyl and I meeting each other by happenstance at the Native American welcoming event at UC Berkeley back in 2010, to our bonding over a First Nations movie at my sister's house during the Kaduk Tribe Basket Weavers gathering a few years later, to even more phone calls and emails and trips and coffees, our lives have become interwoven. So you can see in the timeline that was posted previously that over the years, we've come together through these professional spaces. Yet these relationships now surpass these spaces. The work that we did at Stanford, the creation and the sheer dedication to having these posters come into fruition could not have happened without these nodes of connection and the relationships that were cultivated over the course of a decade. Some new, some old, but at the same time built through a willingness to understand and truly make visible our very human experiences within the Academy. The relationships with our partners, our allies and accomplices form an interconnected web. And while we do share personal and professional interests, there are also points of disjuncture. It's within these nodes of juncture and disjuncture that I believe led to our conversations at Stanford. And then I will pass it back to Sibyl. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. It was really a privilege to meet you on that day on campus, because it led to so many other things. And one of them is co-organizing and hosting this workshop at Stanford. So just to share briefly how we did it, we really started by inviting everyone to share their writing by email in the form of vignettes. And this helped break the ice and get everyone up to speed a bit about our respective experiences before gathering in person. We're so fortunate that we were able to meet before COVID hit. And we took care in our hosting. We really benefited greatly from the support of the Stanford Native community that joined us and helped everyone to get grounded, and invited student friends and colleagues, Gabi Saiz and Maili Yi, who's shown here in the picture. Gabi's Ponca tribe from Nebraska and Maili Yi's Native Hawaiian. And they opened our session and really helped us take a breath before we started on this work, and started us in a good way. Some of us were just meeting each other for the first time. And we compensated them for their time and their contributions. We also shared food and acknowledged the workshop labor, both the labor of the organizational tasks that were part of this, like the note taking, moving the chairs, and also the emotional labor of really engaging in this topic that involves remembering traumatic events. And the workshop also facilitated our ability to see each other, not just in person, but the idea of being seen as a whole person, and being careful and authentic and respectful, and locating the difference in our position and voice as an asset is something that allows us to get to know each other better. And I'll pass back to Corrinne now to share more how we turned the vignettes into these posters. Thank you.
Thanks, Sibyl. We weren't sure when we started and got together how many posters would be developed. Like, there wasn't a set amount, there wasn't any kind of idea about what would be produced or how would be produce it. It's very clear to us, who are the academics, that we are neither creative or nor can develop posters or write storyboards. We needed quite a lot of significant support and help. And we're like, what do you mean? Can't you just draw that up today? No respect for our creative counterparts at Astra, Hugh and Nicole. Yeah, I just have a brain thing. Enormous respect. They worked with us so much to get us to where we needed to be to deliver these stories and give respect to those stories that were shared in those days. It took a lot. For me, really personally, and I don't want to talk for my Indigenous colleagues, but it took a lot to have a moment of trust.
to say, I'm going to give you and share with you my stories and trust that you're not going to use them in a way that is again extractive or that will be weaponized against me? Would I be able to come to this space and use my stories as my weaponry to emancipate myself from the extractive academy? It was an exercise in trust for all of us. And of course, most of us centered ourselves when we first walked into the room and made it all about ourselves, until we had to realize that we would come together as a collective. And what was really poignant in our storytelling and sharing was that it didn't matter what institution we were sitting in, every Indigenous scholar had the same story. And similar stories, and knew exactly what we were talking about and didn't need to explain further. We just understood them. And we tried to capture these stories in these thought bubbles. So whilst the outcome might appear humorous and somewhat simplistic, they are deep level of storying, of sharing, of truth telling. And what they reveal are the violence, but also the accountability that it needs to occur in this space. In developing them though, there were some real challenges, not just in our inability to be highly creative, though some of us were, because they went zombies and I'm like, I don't get that. I don't get it. I get it now. But I didn't get it at first. But what we had to do in conceptualizing the posters was to be able to have a conversation, because they were so poignant to so many different spaces across the globe. How could we tell that story and still have it be relatable in every single one of those spaces? If someone in Turtle Island was to see them, could they see this story, even though it could be seen as an Australian one? You know, so they had to translate, they had to tell stories that would capture the imagination regardless of where they were being seen. So there were some real challenges in trying to tease that out and to make it relatable, representative, without being exploitive in itself or telling stereotypical stories either. So we really had to think about our symbolism. We had to think about how we were going to portray stories through time and space. So you can see in Pass the Ball that we used colour to try and translate that concept of history and how that has been and changed over time. So there's all these things that we ask you and invite you to engage with in the posters, to go beyond just what the words are, but what's presented in the creative output of the symbolism, the pictures, the colouring, and as part of the whole story.
Thanks, Corrinne. And Corrinne and I were giving each other a look because we had a moment we had a moment in Corrinne's office where I got educated. So let me share that now. So initially, just really want to reveal that mistakes are a really important part of the process. So here's a good mistake. Initially, Sibyl and I have a long friendship, but we were on Zoom going, oh, let's do an ally. Let's like talk about all these things that we see going on and do an allyship poster series. You know, because it is really extraordinary experiences that we have, and lots of people want to learn. And at the same time, Sibyl had the cartoonist staying with her. So, you know, this all sort of came together. But as Corrinne pointed out to me, as I sunk into the chair in her office, we had not first asked our Indigenous collaborators, what would you like to do, if anything, with this capacity? And we had sort of put a lot of work into writing something really carefully, and you know, presented a couple of pages, and it was all about allyship. Yeah, it wasn't about Indigenous scholars. So, but we are talking about doing that next. And over to Sibyl now.
Oh, thanks for that, Jess. Yeah, I think we had some definite uncomfortable moments, and so that's where the learning happens, and that's where we get the opportunity to do some unpacking. Um, and I think the next slide might be really good for this too. If the learning here really wasn't perfect, and you know, I appreciated the fact that I got to do this with a friend too, because when you mess up with a friend, you know, they can help get you back on the right track. So the learning wasn't about being perfect. It was about willing to make those mistakes and to learn and then to do something better. And this relates to what Corrinne said when she opened about how important and how challenging it is to learn how to step back and when to step up in solidarity in this work. And it's not like you just automatically know how to do it. And but still we sort of dive in and we do it anyway. And because to do otherwise is not to strive strive to be working from the allied position. And the other thing, Jess and I talked a lot about this, and I appreciate getting to talk to Jess because we learned together too in our sort of different experiences, but still, you know, we overlap in our positionality, how allies are not self-appointed. An ally is really a relational term. So I'm an ally when my colleague and my friends identify me as such. And because of this approach, we get to do partnership and we get to co-create something like these posters in a good way. And we do it across our different positionalities that account for and that pay attention to the different day-to-day experiences that we have in the academy. I don't have to carry the same heavy load that my colleagues have. There might be some intersecting moments, but it's not the same. And that awareness is what then guides our respective roles in the partnership and allow us to grow. So thanks to some leadership and redirection from our friends, we were able to reset the collaboration and pay more attention to what we needed to do to really center the Indigenous scholars in this work. And I'll turn it over to Carolyn to say more.
Thank you, Sibyl. So kind of reflections on the process. Two things that stood out to me were the element of trust, knowing or learning through the course of this whole project that our words would not be weaponized, would not continue this cycle of epistemic violence that so often happens with Indigenous scholars. And then there was also the element of self-assuredness, of being certain in our own identities, to not buckle under the weight of hard truths, to be in that room, to be welcomed into that space on the Stanford campus, for all the stories that were told, the emotions that hung in the air, and the silences that were really potent. Well, it was a months-long journey of careful consideration, scaffolding, and a willingness to drive in. So after the 2 days that we all spent together, we all had a collective phone call to reflect on the process that happened among us. And I'm thankful that the following quote was recorded because I never would have remembered it in this exact way, although the core feeling of that time still reverberates. So here's my reflection on that time of our collaboration and of stepping up and stepping back. So speaking to Sibyl and Jess, I said, I know you well enough that you would not take advantage of our stories, narratives, and our time. I know you, your work, and your intentions. It was fine. As it was presented, it wasn't necessarily Indigenous-led, but I wouldn't feel that way with other folks. With other folks, it would have been generated with an Indigenous partner. But it was also this wild and crazy thing. This was like catnip to me, a creative outlet. Knowing you and the layout of your plan, it was flexible enough that it could turn into something with an Indigenous focus. The framework was there, but within that, there was a lot of room. So I appreciated the step back by our allies, Jess and Sibyl, because it was something that I could voice when I had something to say, and stepping back myself when I didn't have anything to say. I didn't feel put upon to open up my veins or to do a dance. And then I'll pass the ball to the next slide, please.
So this is just to check back in and around our key points here. You know, this is not somewhere else. This is something that's happening here. This is something that's happening in whichever institution, whichever space that you are in. And it's important for all of us to know when we step in and step back and step up. And this actually is part of what it is for Indigenous scholars too. And I think Carolyn was talking about this, about when we had nothing to say as well. And we were 3 Indigenous scholars from 3 different spaces, different countries, different nations, different mob. And so we also had to learn how to respectfully engage with other Indigenous peoples from other spaces and what that means as well. So it was all about knowing when to be, and it's about something that we often forget when we talk about decolonising work, and that's listening. But it's not enough to listen if you're not prepared to hear. Yeah, so holding those thoughts and understanding and identifying what you are centering and decentering at what point in time. I like that. Just one thing, I know you're going to cut me off, but I got the mic. Don't give a Korean mic. If you step in too far, you do not allow space for others. And I think that was the beauty of Jess and Sibyl acknowledging that misstep, that they had stepped in too far, that our voices were almost silenced, but being prepared to listen was the big key. And then hearing, and their hearing was shown in their action.
Thanks, Corrinne. Yeah, no, it was, once you said it, it was so obvious. So it was just really great to have that leadership and trust to go forward. So so we just have some quicks. We're going to go through these quickly because, you know, we're close to end of time. So here are some, people want to know what practically you can do. So the Shakespeare effect is where, you know, you don't have to explain why Shakespeare is important in your grant application, you know, but you're forever having to explain why Indigenous issues are important or Indigenous methods are important. And so it's just really, really important that the entire academy gets across Indigenous research ethics and the Indigenous literature, just so we can just stop that having to explain all that all over the time and have that competency as part of the university. And there's so much out there for you to do it. It's really easy. Google your researchers, do it. And from that, you can learn about, well, what are some of the things that I do that are violences? You know, you know, like the crazy things that go on in some of those really highly codified non-Indigenous publishing spaces, and speak up, you know, so that, you know, people like Corrinne don't always have to be the one that's saying it. So can't emphasize this enough. Read, cite and share Indigenous literature. It's there, it's great, get into it. How about this? Next time you're doing your research or teaching, start with the Indigenous literature and see where that takes you. There's so many Indigenous organisations around in your areas of whatever you're doing. Go and learn about them. I mean, Indigenous people have nation organisations, nation governance organisations where for your campuses and for your fieldwork sites and so on and so forth. Get into it. And, you know, I think I don't need to repeat this one about meaningful relationships. Yes, I don't just go, oh, I need to add an Indigenous thing to this or an Indigenous person. And it's just really transparent. So this is, at the same time, we haven't talked about this in this, but it's about the Indigenous communities who are also, Carolyn talked about service, you know, and working with her community, but there's just so much going on and so much work, and it's just not considered normal in the academy. So it's just really important for some of these things to happen, especially that reference there, it's about the experience of PhD students. So they're a really important part of transforming the academy. And if we can just support the communities that are investing into the academy is making money out of Indigenous communities, just be really good to do some work on that. And now I think I'm passing over to Sibyl.
Thank you, Jess. Thanks for those wonderful insights. I'm just adding the next layer. So, you know, we've talked about how to work in partnership with Indigenous communities and to learn together. But there's also a lot of things you can do to enable structural change, centering Indigenous leadership. So this does relate to some of the decolonizing initiatives that are aspirational, but yet part of what we're working towards. You can put resources towards Indigenous-led initiatives. You can amplify the work of Indigenous leaders and Indigenous scholarship, noting that the scholarship is there, sharing that, reading that, platforming that. You can create specific budgets to support Indigenous-led research. You can hire and support Indigenous scholars. We can collectively be aware of the minority tax, right? Where as an Indigenous person, you are called on to represent in every single space. How then do you have time for your research? So ask Indigenous colleagues how you can best support them, offer your time, resources, team up. And then last, build long-term connections with Indigenous communities. And that can happen through Indigenous scholars or research partnerships with your PhD students or colleagues or non-academic initiatives. We talk a lot about relationship building in this area, and you know, finding a place for starting an authentic relationship. It doesn't take a fancy degree to do that, but it does take time. So I'll pass it back now to Corrinne to close. Thank you.
Thanks, Sibyl. You know, what we think when we're talking about decolonisation work for us in terms of developing these is about, I guess, you know, creating a more inclusive academy and indigenising the academy in the long-term goal of decolonising the academy. But that does not happen unless we repatriate Indigenous life and land. So the work we do, or the work we've done, is about securing a more respectful and inclusive academy and we have learned how to appropriately do that and centre that, and tried to demonstrate how Indigenous voices have been centred and amplified within this process, and how you can contribute to that too. I wonder, I couldn't imagine there's not one person in this room who probably should be considering what Indigenous perspectives are in their work. If you are working on this land, there is an Indigenous voice to speak to it. At this present time, you benefit from the colonial processes that are still in place as you occupy unceded Indigenous land. You have a gift, a privilege, but also the same responsibility to that land and its people to ensure that you are repatriating that work and giving back and including. You actually have a power there. And in order to affect a decolonisation, you're being asked to give up some of your power. And if you don't, then you emerge and maintain yourself as part of the colonial project, as part of the invader, as part of the colonizer. I'd like to thank my colleagues who look terrified about what I've just said. I love it working with Jess. I'd like to thank my colleagues. I'd like to thank Carolyn, Jess, Sibyl, and Beth, who couldn't be with us, and our comic artists, Hugh and Nicole, for all their work. Please feel free to engage with our posters. If you want to do something practical, perhaps it needs to be on your next departmental conversation, so those spaces may not be transactional as they have been. They might be something where a robust discussion could happen. Put them on your doors, put them on your walls, take them home and have a chat with your kids. We've had some feedback across, we've had a big impact across people who have engaged with it globally, just engaging with what this might mean for them and how they feel seen. And I just, you know, best one, holy shit, they really are amazing. Thank you.